Welcome back. President Cyril Ramaphosa made a number of key announcements when he delivered his State of the Nation address on Thursday. For more on the various interventions, we're joined by political analyst Professor Dirk Kotzé, Decode Communications CEO Lorato Tshenkeng, and UKZN Criminology Professor Nirmala Gopal. Good to have you all with us this evening to unpack the SONA, of course. Professor Kotzé, I'll start with you. President Cyril Ramaphosa has positioned organized crime as a top threat, also deploying the SANDF alongside the SAPs in parts of the Western Cape and Gauteng. Let's speak about this politically. What does this say about the state's confidence in policing?
Well, I think, first, good evening. I think he made it actually the number one issue in his SONA address, which I think is very significant. Obviously, we all know what he's talking about and have experiences about it. But the fact that he addressed it so early in his speech, I think is highly significant. Over and above his announcement about the deployment of SANDF troops in Western Cape or Cape Town, the Cape Flats, as well as in Gauteng, he referred to the Matlanga Commission. And what is significant and which doesn't receive a lot of attention is the way in which he presents it or presented it as that a forum on which basis a complete reform of the criminal justice system is supposed to take place. Now, for me, that is highly significant because it means it's not only about those issues that General Mkhwanazi raised in July last year. It's not about only the evidence that they hear from Ekurhuleni and from other places, but it is about the integration of both the SAPS, crime intelligence, the prosecuting authority, as well as other components of it, the judiciary. So I think that is really the way in which it should be done. It should not be a focus merely on the police service and trying to reconstruct them or just appoint more police persons.
Lorato, from a communications perspective, this announcement has been met with mixed feelings, if you will. Yeah. But how effective has government been, in your view, especially in its messaging, in reassuring citizens that the action on the part of government is not unlawful and that it's targeted and not a sign of weakness on the part of the state?
Good evening, Tlantan. Good evening to the other panelists. I think South Africans can literally just go back to 2020 during the lockdown. Remember, during the lockdown, soldiers were on the streets ensuring that there is compliance with the lockdown regulations, right? And we saw to some extent a use of some excessive force. And I think the chatter really on social media and the response come from that to say, while we accept that there's a need to deal with illegal mining, particularly in Gauteng, and of course gang violence in the Cape Flats, what does it mean for ordinary South Africans who may then be victims to how, a little bit forceful soldiers can be? Yeah. But again, it's a good sign, or at least, when you also observe the charter, besides the Human Rights Research Commission's research that says that only 22% of South Africans have confidence in police services. Then it goes on to say it makes sense why you then need a different type of response to ensure that there is a way to deal with this issue, particularly organized crime.
Professor Gopal, let's bring you into the conversation as well. From a criminology standpoint, what are the risks of militarizing crime hotspots in Gauteng and the Western Cape? And how can we avoid normalizing army presence, especially in civilian spaces?
So good evening, Nhlantla, and good evening to my fellow panelists. So I think, for me, my initial response was that I think something that the president has to do very quickly is to really draw out the mandate for SANDF's presence both in Gauteng as well as in the Western Cape. So I think without that mandate at hand, it becomes very difficult to actually comment on what we believe or what we might believe will be the efficacy of the SANDF in these spaces. However, having said that, Nhlantla, I think, when we look at the National Development Plan of 2030, one of the main components of that in National Development Plan, especially with regards to policing, is to move away from a militarized policing. So I think when we think about the military being brought into these critical spaces, it begs the question, are we moving, retrospectively? Are we moving away from a demilitarization of the police? So that I think is one of the most critical issues for me. But the second issue again is that previously we've had the SANDF in the Western Cape. It seemed as though it was a knee-jerk reaction. It was temporary. And while the president says that based on the successes of the previous presence of the SANDF in the Western Cape specifically, I mean, one would ask, why would we need to have them there again if it was successful? So I think these are critical and crucial questions one must ask in respect of what's being proposed at this current point in time.
Professor Kotzé, as we know, it is a big election year in 2026, and with municipal elections coming up, could this crime crackdown then boost, especially the governments or the government or the parties represented in the GNU? Could this improve their credibility, or might it reinforce a perception that the state reacts rather than governs proactively here?
Well, I think they would try to present it as part of the proactive measures taken by the Government of National Unity in general. I think the ANC would love to receive some credit for this in the Western Cape especially, because they've lost support consistently over the last number of elections. So, I mean, we can never throw away or discard the idea that there's some political components also included in such a step. It's not completely politically innocent or politically neutral, but I think what is more maybe of important is that they want to demonstrate to the voters in general that they've not lost the battle in these areas, that it's not as if the criminality is taking over and there's no way of fighting back or come with alternative measures. I think what one should also say is that the way in which I understand it is that the military won't receive policing functions or powers. They are there in a sense to do the patrolling, to take over some of the routine functions that the police is supposed to do, but they simply don't have the numbers in order to do it. So that the police then become more involved in the investigative functions of policing, while the military is there to show force, especially those where there's the use of weapons, like on the Cape Flats are being used, and to try to swamp, in a sense, the area, so that it becomes very difficult for these persons still to continue with their gang violence, which is to a large extent in the open space, and communities become then victims of that. So I think that is the main idea of it, but it cannot last very long, because over time they also become used to that presence. So it is really a test for the government and for the criminal justice system and for policing in general, how successful will this will be, because this is a very old phenomenon. You know, I come from the Cape myself, and when I was still very young, these type of things happened there already. So there's something which has to, the culture must be addressed. It's not just about policing functions that must be displayed there. It's about completely new social structure and social dynamics that must be developed.
Lorato, to take the words of Professor Kotzé, this moment does represent a test for South Africa's government as well. But as we discussed earlier, public response has been quite mixed. And how should leaders then balance a tough law and order messaging with the transparency, especially around issues of costs, timelines, and also measurable outcomes through this intervention?
Sure. And I guess it starts there, Ntantla. So when you remember the initial deployment of the soldiers back in 2020, there was the backlash because the way the president did it, it was the wrong way round, right? But of course, in his speech, he then iterated, or at least reiterated, that they are going to do the things the right way around, where you know they will inform Parliament and all of that. So you can tell that there's an intention to demonstrate that we have learned our lessons. The second part, and this is one of the things that Prof Kotzé raised, right, where while it may be communicating that we are doing something, because if you think about the biggest critique from the Zondo Commission versus the Madlanga Commission is that Zondo Commission gave you a voluminous report, and only after you received the report, you started acting.
Right.
And now there's a shift in, we are going to act as revelations come out, as we are finding things out. But lastly, for me, it's going to be, if you think about some of the things that they have to deal with, a lot of South Africans are affected by contact crime. So if the deployment of soldiers is not going to reduce contact crime, so just think about in the Western Cape, for instance, in particular, ambulances have to be escorted by police, particularly in the evenings. Are the soldiers going to be supporting that kind of a thing? So it's almost that, kind of thing that if on a quarter-to-quarter basis, when there are stats that are put out by the Minister of Police, will we be seeing a downward trend? And if we are not, then the confidence, or at least the thing that they want to do with this action in particular, it will not necessarily matter when we go to the polls for the local government elections.
I'll tell you what, let's grab a sip of water and continue this discussion. Of course, unpacking all the events at the State of the Nation address this week, and also the deployment of the SAPs, or rather the SANDF, to assist the SAPs in parts of Gauteng as well as the Western Cape. Continuing this discussion in a short while. Do stay with us. Thanks a lot for staying with us. We continue our panel discussion this evening, unpacking some of the events at the SONA this week, as President Cyril Ramaphosa announced the deployment of the army in places including Western Cape as well as Gauteng. We're still joined by political analyst Professor Dirk Kotzé, Decode Communications CEO Lorato and Tshenkeng, as well as UKZN Criminology Professor Nirmala Gopal. Professor Gopal, I'll continue with you. Beyond enforcement, what evidence-based social interventions are most effective, especially when addressing issues around the root cause of gang violence and organized crime?
Yes, I mean, I was just reflecting on the submissions that we're listening to. And I think before I come to that question, just to say that for me as a criminologist, certainly the the president's intervention at this point in time is reactive rather than proactive. I think what would be proactive is if we had to begin, or if the state had to begin, by addressing the socio-economic causes of crime. And when we look at gang violence and we unpack or disaggregate the factors, we know that part of it is issues of power because of the drug trade or drug trafficking that goes on within the province. And that's largely what influences or is one of the major contributing factors to violence in the area. Then I think it's also, issues of greed, issues of power, etc. So I think unless we start to address those matters, it's going to be very difficult to actually eradicate gang violence, and even going as far as organized crime in the Western Cape. And I think what's very important in Plant Place to understand that there's a reciprocal relationship between organized crime and gang violence. And I think what's of even greater concern is that bringing in the SANDF or the army into the Western Cape area is you are dealing with the symptom. The real drug lords, the kingpins in the organized crime syndicates, etc., are actually going through untouched. And for as long as we are unable to find them and prosecute those individuals, the problem is not going to go away from the perspective of a criminologist nonetheless.
Yeah. Professor Kotzé, as we react to this, the president also announced lifestyle audits and re-vetting in law enforcement as well. Let's touch on this. Politically, does this restore confidence or even highlight deep corruption within the police service?
Yeah, I think it's very much in response to what we hear at the Maklanga Commission and the ad hoc committee in Parliament. And that we start to see for ourselves now how many high-profile persons or high-ranking persons in the police service and other parts of the criminal justice system are implicated. So this is one of the aspects which it's not going to be a solution, but it is a way in which I think President Ramaphosa wants to demonstrate that something which is highly unpopular in those circles, and that's lifestyle audits, that he is willing to stick out his neck and to say, well, this is going to become compulsory. So it's not so much about solving the problem. It's rather saying, I want to make sure that it's not, that it doesn't continue, life doesn't continue as if there's no intervention, there's no changes being made. I think on top of it will then be the other actions, like, for example, when persons are taken to court, there's some people there will be disciplinary hearings, some people will be removed from their positions, all of that together. So lifestyle audits on their own won't make much of a difference. But if it is seen as part of a package in conjunction with these others, then I think it will make a difference. Because it will also then say to potential persons who want to be in those positions, be appointed in those positions, your history must be clean. You must have, in some instances, a security clearance. You must be cleared through a lifestyle audit, and you must be a competent person. So I think these are the combined messages that is being sent through this.
Lorato, I'd be quite keen to hear your thoughts around whether the issuing of lifestyle audits inspires any confidence, but also added to that, how important is consistent follow-up communication, especially compared to big announcements during speeches like the State of the Nation address, in really rebuilding trust in society?
So, and again, the trouble with big announcements, right, is that if you think about, let's go to when the president came into or became president in 2018, one of the top, or at least top on his agenda, was performance contracts with his executive members, right? We then got to find out that, I think a year later, those performance contracts were in place, but they were never made public. So you and I, while we know that there is a contract between him and Minister X, Y, or Z, we do not know what is contained in there. Therefore, we can't hold them accountable. So similarly with this, there have been a couple of these. We know in Gauteng, a similar call was done by the Premier of Gauteng, where there were going to be lifestyle audits, particularly on accounting officers, political principals, and some senior people, particularly in procurement divisions, right? How much of that have we seen? And I think because there is no translation there, a lot of the citizenry hear a lot of these big announcements, but they are not seeing them translating into. We see the announcement that you've made, but we are not seeing the, at least you revealing that out of the 10 people, 8 were found squeaky clean, but these 8 were found to be troublesome, and these are the consequences that we're going to, at least going to meet for them to be dealt with. And I think, in a space where consequence management is a catchphrase, I don't think that it's something that is going to land. And unfortunately, the president has not made it a habit of, let me show you or demonstrate to you, this is what I said in the previous SONA, and this is what I did, particularly when it comes to holding his members of the executive accountable.
Professor Gopal, with thousands of new police recruits being added, what safeguards are needed to ensure that training, oversight, and ethical conduct keep pace with recruitment as well, with those processes?
So I think, like the other panelists have already mentioned, constant and consistent monitoring and evaluation in terms of, their fitness to continue their training, their, making sure that they are ethical. And I think part of that ethics and continuous ethical monitoring would be, ensuring that they take these ethical tests every 3 months, because I think unless we do that quite consistently and frequently, the unethical behavior creeps into the South African police services very quickly and, without anybody really noticing or realizing it. But I think more important than that, Nhlanhla, is to hold senior police officers accountable, ensure that the younger recruits are actually able to see that the more senior officers are being held accountable, and that, of course, more importantly, that there is consequence management. I think one of the biggest issues that we're having in the South African public service is that there's little to no consequence management, hence the state of our public services in terms of how we have it at the moment. So I think consequence management, consistent and more frequent in-service training, tests, whether they're psychometric tests, etc., for ethical conduct, reinforcing ethical behavior, but also making sure that our young recruits are held accountable and responsible, but also to make sure that the older police officers serve as really good role models to them.
Professor Kotzé, a lot can be said about troubles that we've seen in coalition arrangements, but how might coalition politics at both national and metro level then affect coordination, especially in implementing anti-crime strategies for South Africa?
Yes, that is an interesting point. I think when it comes to at the national level, the government of national unity or cabinet in general is structured around cabinet clusters, and there's a cabinet cluster specifically for security. So that is a strong coordinating function that does exist to bring the different departments and ministries together in order to cooperate. It's there since the time of President Mbeki already. At the other levels, unfortunately, it does not necessarily exist at the provincial level and at local level or metro level. So I think that is a shortcoming that certainly will have to be attended to, because what we have seen now is that, for example, what is happening in a metro like Ekurhuleni, all the problems have now been exposed, or many of the problems at least, again in the Matlanga Commission specifically, but also in Parliament. So it shows where the weaknesses are, where the limitations are, and certainly there will have to be much better cooperation I think one of the problems, and that is the Western Cape has identified it over time, is that the policing function of the SAPS is a national function, not many powers are present or can be used at the provincial level. And that, I think, is something which will have to be revisited at some point again, because that is certainly something which, that coordination between the national and provincial levels are not always as it should be. At the metro level, because it's mainly metros that can have a policing function, it's very difficult. One sees it in practice where there's very, very often differences of opinion between the SAPS and Metro, who is supposed to do what when they see something that's happening. So again, there is some questions. I think one aspect which is becoming slightly more prominent, I'm not saying it is already being established, is the role of crime intelligence or intelligence in general, but specifically crime intelligence, because we've seen, General Mkhwanazi and others have emphasized that the importance of that, whether it's in task teams or not. But that is absolutely essential for effective policing, and in the end also for prosecution purposes. So that is one area. If we think back to the days of state capture, that is actually one of the key components of the police service that was absolutely undermined because of state capture. So that is some of the challenges that must be restored or must be addressed in order to establish a more reliable and effective criminal justice system.
Lorato, when economic concerns dominate public anxiety, how should crime interventions be framed, especially within a broader socio-economic recovery narrative?
Sure. So, and I guess one of the challenges, and I'm glad that both Prof Gopal and Prof Kotzé raised this, or at least to say, while you have the intervention with the soldiers, the biggest thing are the socio-economic conditions that South Africans, at least live through, right? And when you have, and I have, a simple anecdote, a gentleman who collects rubbish, or is a waste picker, he had his trolley stolen in my street, right? So there's somebody who's trying to make a livelihood, and then they are affected in that way. So it means that, one, their ability for increasing their earning potential, or at least just maintaining their earning potential, becomes an issue. And then combine that with inflation, that when it affects him, he then cannot. So I'm saying almost at a day-to-day, experience of an ordinary South African, the cost of living is a thing that is, part of the consistent, conversations. Do we want to hear that, we've been out of the issue of the grey listing? That is critical, because then it talks about government being able to borrow, from, other funds that are available and all of that. So the combination of the two from a macro and a micro point of view, I think the government is doing exceptionally well in communicating what the benefits of being removed from the grey listing means. But when you think about this gentleman whose, trolley has been stolen, and when he goes to the police, he knows that the likelihood of him reporting it and it being recovered, or at least him getting the sense that it will help, it means that his livelihood is being affected. Many small business owners, struggle with that on a regular, right? And the sense of, lack of, call it a very responsive policing, then gives us a sense that even when you're trying to do something to ensure that you maintain your economic, or at least you maintain a relatively positive economic outlook, it is very difficult to do that because the policing is not as responsive. Sometimes you even get police officers saying to you that, no, listen, maybe you must just go and claim this from the insurance. And it tells a lot about how, they don't even have their own confidence in their own processes.
Well, in a short while, we continue our discussion with our panel of guests, also discussing issues around gun control reforms as well. In a short while, of course, coming from the State of the Nation address delivered by President Cyril Ramaphosa this week. We continue our discussion in a short while. Welcome back. We continue our discussion and also getting final thoughts from our panel of guests this evening. We have Decode Communications CEO Lorato Tshenkeng, as well as political analyst Professor Dirk Kotzé and UKZN criminology expert Professor Nirmala Gopal. Professor Gopal, I had mentioned before we went to break the mention of gun control reform issues that also emanated from the SONA. Let's speak about this a bit more. What legislative or enforcement gaps allow illegal firearms to keep circulating, especially in our communities?
So I think by and large, Nhlanhla, is, one thing that we've already seen by now is that the current legislation is not working. There is a bill that's being amended at this point in time. And when I looked at the the amendment in the bill, one of my thoughts was that why do we continuously call it gun control? We should change the words in the bill, and I think we should look for words that are talking about the eradication of guns rather than controlling guns, because I think for me that would go a longer way, even though they're just words. But I think words are so powerful because the fact that we keep mentioning guns and wanting to control its infiltration, its circulation, its use in criminality, etc. I think what it actually does is that it reinforces the whole idea of having a community where we allow these guns to circulate, etc. So at this point in time, of course, we welcome the amendment to the bill that's currently being scrutinized. But by and large, I think, for as long as we have porous borders through which we know guns come through, but also the fact that many of the guns that we find being used in criminality especially come from SANDF, comes from South African Police Services and from private security firms. So the state has to come up with much stricter measures in terms of how they react or respond to these kind of illegal movements of guns in the country. But I must say it's very complex. They've tried many kinds of interventions in the past. They have very little effect, but going forward, it has to be an integrated process as well in terms of ensuring that the guns that are coming through from SAPS, SANDF, as well as private security companies, that they actually are registered in a way that they should be, and that the minute guns go missing from SAP stations, etc., that they are reported immediately, and that there should be accountability in terms of SAP's personnel under whose guard or watch the guns actually go missing.
Yeah. Professor Kotzé, the infrastructure investment drive has been described as historic. But can improved service delivery realistically then reduce protest-driven instability like we've seen in our communities, but also crime in vulnerable communities?
Well, if we talk about investment in general, that's one of the key priorities of President Ramaphosa. It talks about the investment fund. There's not going to be quite soon in March, I think the 6th international investment conference that he will have. And that is, in a sense, he sees it or he uses it as an external funding of projects inside South Africa. And it comes from, therefore, not from South African sources directly, although a lot of the investments are coming from within South Africa also. But in that sense, that is, for me, it appears as if that is the key of President Ramaphosa's economic plan, macroeconomic plan, the development of infrastructure, that it must be funded by foreign direct investment, also South African investments. That will lead then to better service conditions in terms of water, electricity, and other forms of improving the living conditions of people. the logic is that that will make it then easier for them to be able to start with businesses. Electricity, for example, if that becomes also cheaper, that will, and as well as the digital environment, that will be able to kickstart economic development at the level where there's more job creation can happen. So there are some results already. He also at the same time uses the concept of Operation Vulindlela, which is the private-public partnerships, again, within infrastructural development. So it is permeating right through his thinking about the economic model that he wants to establish for the foreseeable future in South Africa.
Yeah. Let's also add your voice to this, Lorato. How can private sector and civil society efforts then be integrated, especially into a unified anti-corruption communication strategy as well for South Africa?
Sure. So one of the things that we've seen, particularly from the private sector, right, they are at least investing in infrastructure. So if you think about when you drive around the suburbs, particularly in Gauteng and even or at least in many metros, you see a lot of CCTV cameras. That is not, that's not infrastructure by government, or at least by the metros, as it were. But you then hear, or at least see, somebody like Premier Panyaza Lesufi saying that there are bilaterals that are being had with these private security companies to say, how do we share the information or knowledge such that we are then able to, one, identify the criminals or incidents of criminality, and then identify the criminals, and then eventually, apprehending them, leading to, investigation and prosecution. So that is a good model of doing that, right? But the biggest question, and I guess from, the question you asked earlier around crime intelligence, is that to what extent do these private securities then, almost call it commercialize that and profit from government? Because you want certain things to remain public goods, right? And in this way, where they know that they have the access and they are then able to commercialize it, I think it becomes a problem. And lastly, on civil society, one of the things that they've been doing exceptionally well has been mobilizing around responses. You were speaking to Prof Gopal around the amendment bill on gun control that is now, right? We know that ordinarily it's going to be one of those that just, is below the radar, and civil society does exceptionally well in ensuring that, one, people are aware of these engagements that are happening in Parliament, and when there's public participation, they then mobilize society. So we need a lot more of that, because in that way, that there'll be some rigor and and contribution in a lot of these either laws or even the amendments thereof.
Lorato, let me thank you for your time as well. He's a Decode Communications CEO. Lorato Tshenkeng, a political analyst, Professor Dirk Kotzé, also joining us for this discussion. Let me also thank UKZN Criminology Professor Nirmala Gopal, giving us her perspective, of course, unpacking some of the announcements made this week as part of this